like to take a few minutes just to thank the Duke Energy Initiative for providing funding for our event here today. Also, the Duke Bar Association. They really made this happen, and we couldn't have done this without them. So they've been a huge part of what we do here. We've got a fantastic guest speaker here today to speak on the future of solar power in the U.S. Mr. Warburg is a former attorney with the Environmental Law Institute in Washington. He also spent several years with the Israel Union for Environmental Defense, one of Israel's leading environmental advocacy groups, and most recently he served as the president of the Conservation Law Foundation, one of New England's largest environmental watchdog groups. Since 2012, Mr. Warburg has authored several books, the first on the future of wind energy, and most recently on the future of solar power in the U.S., which he'll be speaking about today. So you'll join me in welcoming Mr. Warburg.
I want to thank Garrett for your months of preparing for this. I really appreciate it very much, and it's great to be here at Duke. I want to start with a promise, and that is that this will not be a typical law school lecture. So instead of talking a lot about case law and precedent, what I really want to do is talk about solar technology primarily and how it's being applied from the ground up. But I want to start by just giving you a little bit of a sense of how solar and wind, the two topics that I really have focused a great deal of research and attention on, interface with each other. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which you're probably familiar with, the government's research center for renewable energy, has estimated that by 2050, we could be getting half of our total power needs from the wind and the sun using existing, commercially existing and competitive technologies today. So if that's the case, using currently available technologies, you can imagine where we might be 35 years from now. And this same study that they did, it's called Renewable Electricity Futures, estimated that if you throw in other forms of renewable energy, ocean, biomass, geothermal, et cetera, we could get up to about 80% of our total power needs from renewable sources. So we're looking at a true transformation in the resource base of our electricity supply if we choose to go that route. Let's make sure this is working. It's working. How many of you are familiar with the duck curve? Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining it, but what's really important about it is that while today we're generating a good deal of electricity that is not renewable, and during the middle of the day and consistently and ramping up a bit in the evening hours, with solar energy, you've got a problem because you get a lot of energy produced during daylight hours, and then just as the solar availability drops, you end up with a major surge in power demand. And one of the great ways that solar and wind can be complementary is by expanding our grid infrastructure. And one of the challenges there from a legal and other standpoint is that we have built our grid infrastructure as what some people call a network of country roads as opposed to an interstate highway system. Decisions about transmission infrastructure are largely made by state public utility commissions, and that creates a problem if you want to build a broader regional balancing between different renewable technologies. And what happens, as many of you probably know or can surmise, is that we have great solar potential throughout the country. I want to be clear. With Germany, a very rainy climate, as the world leader in solar technology, it's clear you don't need California sunlight to succeed in implementing solar. However, solar is richest in the Southwest, as you can see from the red areas on this map. Wind is richest through the Great Plains, going from the Dakotas on down through Texas. So between these two, one can imagine the challenges of creating a true regional grid where you can balance between the daylight hour sunshine in, let's say, California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and the wind power, which happens to be stronger generally in the nighttime hours, blowing through the Great Plains states. So there's a true transformative challenge that we need to face as we build out a robust renewable energy grid. But I want to focus predominantly today, at least in my remarks, on solar technology. And I want to start by asking, how many of your families have solar on their homes? Okay. How many of your family's neighbors have solar on their homes? Hands? Okay, some. So what we're beginning to see is that solar is part of our daily lives, whether we're investing in it ourselves, our families, et cetera, or whether we're part of a broader community that is basically saying this is a technology that we want to embrace. We might want to embrace it because it lowers our reliance upon non-renewable resources, carbon emissions, et cetera. We might like the fact that it creates predictability going forward in terms of what we're going to pay for our electric power. And it also allows us to take charge of at least a portion of the power that we are consuming in our daily lives. And it's this concept of taking charge that points to a dynamic that I've actually found very interesting as I've done my research, and that is that we tend to think of solar energy and renewable energy as the domain of the progressive side of the political spectrum, let's say. But what's interesting about solar, and in particular distributed solar generation, is that it has very strong support among the libertarian right, who basically very strongly feel that people should be able to generate their own power at the household level, at the business level, and sell that power to their utilities at the full retail value of that power. That becomes a very controversial proposition, as I'm sure many of you know, with the net metering debates that are happening in 20 or more states today. But it's interesting to see people like former Congressman Barry Goldwater Jr., Congressman from California, now living in Arizona, chairing a group called TUSC, Tell Utilities Solar Won't Be Killed. And this is a very strident advocacy group for the right of homeowners to defend their power generation and get fair compensation for that power generation. Is it a sign that there's a potential to bridge the political chasm that exists in this country on a whole range of issues? I don't know, but at least around this particular issue, we're seeing some degree of common ground between different political factions. When I was just wrapping up my book about wind power, people often ask me what my next book would be about. And often they said, solar, right? And my flip response at the time was that if I ever wrote a book about solar, I'd have to call it Dim Sun. And the reason I said that was because at that time, solar just seemed to be pricing itself out of the market. And I was happy to be proven wrong in the years that followed. As you can see from these charts, the drop in the installed cost per watt of PV photovoltaics has been dramatic since the first quarter of 2012 to the first quarter of 2015. We're looking at 46% drop in residential and utility scale solar, and we're looking at a 52% drop in commercial scale solar. So very dramatic drop in the price of solar technology. That's moving a lot of people towards saying, well, solar power is something that we really should be taking very seriously. Just as one other indicator, during the first half of 2015, when you look at new installed electric generating capacity, solar accounted for 39% of that capacity. Wind accounted for 36% of that capacity. Add the two together, you get to 75% of all new generating capacity coming from these two renewable energy sources. A pretty phenomenal statement as to the trend going forward. Obviously, solar remains a very, very small fraction of our overall power supply, but when you look at what is being invested in, that's a very significant sea change. My own family made the jump to solar in the wintry months of 2013 when we decided to install solar on our home. And it was just a couple of days after one of New England's legendary snowstorms. I live in Boston. And we frankly expected that the solar firm was not going to show up. It did show up. And among the crew was a guy named Liam Madden. Liam Madden is an Iraqi war veteran, and he came back from serving in Iraq determined to advance sustainable energy technologies in America because he really felt that he was risking his life and many other people's lives, in large part fighting wars over energy resources. And so he became a solar installer. Tough guy, got out of his truck, looked up at our roof and blanched. And the reason he blanched is our roof, as you can kind of see here, is a rather steep roof. It's a 55-degree slope. And I said, what's the problem? And he said, well, I've never been on a roof this steep before. So here's this tough former soldier basically not being very happy about the prospect of this installation challenge, but he and his teammates in total silence installed our solar array. And since that time, we get about 75% of our total power needs averaged over the year from the sun, and that includes the nightly charging of a plug-in electric vehicle. So we have really made the leap. About 750,000 American households have made that leap as well. So it's a very significant move toward renewable energy at the household scale, and it's happening at other scales as well. We're looking at big box stores like Kohl's, like IKEA, like Walmart deciding to invest in solar. Walmart today has about 250 solar roofs. Its goal is to have about 1,000 solar roofs in the next few years. And we're also seeing solar on some other iconic structures. This I took on my flight down here on Sunday night at Logan Airport. You can imagine what these people are looking at on the television. The flight was going to Denver, so that might give you a further hint. And I decided I wanted to look and see what NFL stadiums had invested in solar. I'd been looking into this before. Turned out that neither the Panthers nor the Broncos Stadium had solar, but Levi Stadium did. As you can see here, there's a solar bridge, and they have solar on the building itself. And this is happening at about a half a dozen NFL stadiums, which is kind of a sign of a very mainstream but public image-oriented entity deciding that solar power is a good bet. And one of the facilities at which solar has been installed is the FedEx Field, home of the Redskins. And they there installed a lot of solar parking canopies. Can you guess what the biggest challenge was in installing these solar canopies? Anyone want to guess? This is a hint. So tailgate parties, right? People throwing footballs. So what they had to do was calculate the arc of the typical football thrown and make sure that the canopies were high enough that the footballs weren't going to come crashing down on the solar arrays on a regular basis. And today, those parking canopy spots are the most coveted parking spaces in the stadium. So football stadiums are a very high visibility, public image-oriented use of solar technology, not necessarily impressive in terms of the amount of solar energy that is being tapped. More interesting, less visible, certainly less glamorous is what's happening on warehouse rooftops in places like New Jersey. This particular facility is a food storage warehouse in Carteret, New Jersey. It's a building that's a quarter of a mile long, lots of refrigeration load. They get 90% of their power from the sun. And a lot of New Jersey's solar potential actually lies in places like this that you don't necessarily see. This is not exactly what you'd call greenfield solar, but it's a very promising application of solar technology. And if you really want to look at the kind of gritty aspects of where solar has significant potential, looking at brownfield solar is a very important opportunity. the US EPA has a program called Repowering America's Land, and it has looked at what the potential is for solar power on sites such as former landfills, mining areas, factory sites, and it estimates that looking at over 100,000 different sites, if we were to tap all of the solar potential of those sites, we could be getting about 3 times our total power needs from the sun. That's not to say that every one of those sites would be easy to connect to solar because of related transmission issues or the cleanup challenges involved, but it's happening in lots of places, including on the south side of Chicago. South side of Chicago is, as you probably know, a very tough part of the world. Used to be pretty thriving in a lot of industrial respects. International Harvester used to have an assembly plant in the West Pullman neighborhood, and what they, when they pulled out in the early 80s, it wasn't until 2008 that Exelon decided to come in and build a solar facility on a very contaminated wasteland. And today, 1,500 households get their electricity from this solar farm. Local jobs were created, and it turned what was an environmental menace and a safety hazard into an economic and environmental amenity. I wish I could say that crime on the south side of Chicago had been mitigated in some manner by this facility, but unfortunately the major source of breakage at this particular plant is stray bullets falling from the sky. So there is still a problem in this area, but this was land that was going disused and neglected over decades and is now serving a productive purpose and also created a good number of jobs in the process. But it's not just what's happening at individual sites where we're seeing solar really take off. It's entire communities that are deciding to invest in solar. And here, too, there's an interesting kind of, I think, paradox where one might want to look at Marin County. We were talking about Marin a few minutes ago. Marin is an upscale county just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. They've created a community choice aggregation entity that has wrested control away from Pacific Gas and Electric and serves as a power purchasing and selling entity, offering residents an option of what they call light green solar, which is 50% renewable, or dark green solar, which is 100% renewable. So that's the kind of story you might expect coming out of a place that the senior George Bush once called the realm of hot tubbers. Less intuitive is what's happening in a city called Lancaster, California. How many of you have heard of Lancaster? 2, maybe. Okay. So Lancaster is a city of 160,000 people in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And for a long time, it was known as the center for gang warfare until a guy named Rex Paris, a class action litigation lawyer, very successful, ran on a crime fighter platform. He's a hard-line right-wing politician, and he came in saying he was going to take care of gang warfare in Lancaster. He put, as he claimed to me, 20,000 people behind bars. And as he said, when it comes to people who are involved in gang warfare, the Constitution doesn't apply. So not exactly a paragon of, let's say, legal respect. But when it came to solar energy, he became equally dedicated to developing this technology. And he went to a conference in China several years ago, and he was with other city mayors, including the mayors of cities of 20, 30 million people. And he stood up and he announced that his city, which no one had heard of, was going to become the solar capital of the world. And I think his staff blanched, and they went back home and they did their homework, and they started developing a whole range of regulations, put solar on a variety of public buildings, schools, encourage businesses to do the same, the local sports stadium, and they wrote into the local ordinances that any new residential unit built in Lancaster has to have solar on its roof, 1 kilowatt installed, or off-site solar of an equivalent amount that is serving that particular residential unit. So that's a good example of how, going forward in growth areas, you can begin to insinuate solar into the building infrastructure. But it's not always easy to develop solar in built areas, and I learned that when I visited my daughter at George Washington University. I asked her if she knew of any solar that was being built at GW, and she took me to what she believed, rightly, was the only photovoltaic array on the GW campus at the time, and it was this solar table. Good enough to charge up a couple cell phones or a laptop or two. That was it. She was underwhelmed, I was underwhelmed, and then the following spring, GW opened up its $300 million LEED Gold certified engineering center. Solar on the roof? No. DC height standards prohibited, we were told. And again, pretty disappointing. However, 2 months later, GW announced that it was signing a number of power purchase agreements with 3 solar farms that are actually located in North Carolina. And it, together with American University and the GW Health Center, would soon be getting 50% of their power from the sun. And that array, that set of solar farms is now in operation, I learned the other day. So that is an important way that a campus can both address the challenge of investing in a sustainable energy future as a perhaps parallel to what we hear a lot about, which is the divest of fossil fuels movement that is sweeping lots of university campuses. Building solar in open spaces presents its own challenges, and I visited a number of solar farms on a utility scale. This one happens to be in California. It's on the Carrizo Plain, which some people call California's Serengeti, which is a pretty generous statement. But there are some biological resources that are certainly worth paying attention to. And when the SunPower Corporation began to develop this project, they brought in a team of biologists to look very carefully at what the species were that were vulnerable and should be protected during and after the construction process. 2 of the species that they identified were the San Joaquin kit fox and the giant kangaroo rat. And they built temporary dens for the kit fox and what they called temporary condos for the kangaroo rats. Once the facilities were built, they've allowed the creatures to re-inhabit the sites. They've also created migratory corridors between the solar fields so that antelope and elk can continue their traditional patterns of migration unimpeded. And the solar developers set aside 12,000 acres in conservation land in perpetuity. And this is for a project that I should say takes up about 1,400 acres for its solar arrays and generates enough electricity for about 100,000 California households. So it's an example of where responsible action can be taken to minimize environmental harm caused by the building of utility-scale solar projects. Even with those precautions, there is a great deal of resistance to utility-scale solar. And a lot of that comes from the land conservation community, so there's a certain tension, you could say, within the environmental and conservation community over utility-scale solar. Where renewable energy advocates say, look, if we're going to get solar to a scale that is really going to make a difference, we can't just do it within the built environment. We've got to be doing it on open spaces as well. And then conservationists saying, let's not industrialize our open spaces. And that raises a question of, well, what exactly are our open spaces? And if you look, for example, at corn production in America, we grow corn on 88 million acres of land in America. About 35% of that is dedicated to ethanol production, which is a marginal fuel when it comes to its environmental benefits at best. If we were to use half of the land that we now dedicate to ethanol production, we could be generating all of our electricity from the sun. And that's an example of land where wouldn't exactly say that there's a biodiversity treasure that you're somehow encroaching upon by building solar farms. So this is a kind of debate that is really happening about utility-scale solar. It will evolve in the coming years. I'm sure there'll be a lot of legal debate and legal cases on the subject going forward. And it brings us back to what is the real potential within our built environment. And again, going back to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, they have done a study which estimates that we could be getting about a fifth of our total power needs from rooftop solar alone. And it's both home rooftops, it's also rooftops like you're seeing here. I took this photo out of a plane landing at Miami International Airport going to the Miami Book Fair. And I call this the rooftop desert. You've heard of food deserts. Well, this is the rooftop desert. Huge areas of totally unused roof space that could be used for solar development. I took this picture about 3 minutes later. It's a residential community, again in Miami, lots of sun, no solar panels. And there are various reasons why that's happening in Florida, but we have a huge untapped rooftop solar resource that we could really be developing. There are limits to what we can put on our roofs, and one of those limits is that a lot of Americans live in rental properties where they actually don't have a choice as to what their roofs are used for. About a third of American households are rental households, so that's a significant constraint. Other households have a lot of shading, that's a constraint. But what is happening in North Carolina, although it's much better developed, farther developed in various other places, is what's called community solar, which is allowing people to buy shares in facilities like you see here. This is the Venatucci Solar Farm in Colorado Springs, and there are 600 subscribers to this solar farm. People might buy the equivalent of one solar array or two or three or four or five, and then they get the equivalent amount of output deducted from their electric bills. So this is happening in a good number of states and is a great solution to move rooftop solar beyond your own individual rooftop to facilities like this, which don't happen to be on the roof, or in fact like this, which is the Seattle Aquarium, which is a community solar facility as well. One of the challenges that we really haven't begun to make very great inroads in is how do you bring solar into low-income communities? And I explored what's been happening in a number of states, and the answer is not very much. In North Carolina, there's a group called NC Warren, which is trying to develop some low-income solar, but we're really talking about perhaps dozens of units, not really more at this point. California is really leading the way. California's law requires that the three big investor-owned utilities invest $300 million in low-income solar development on single-family housing and multifamily housing. They estimate that they will be reaching about 15,000 households going forward. And I visited one of those households in the Bayview district of San Francisco. The Huang family, as a result of the solar array that is being installed there, will be generating 90% of their power from the sun. That's a huge benefit to their budget, and it's also a good benefit to us in terms of reducing the climate, the carbon impacts of that household. And what happens here, which is great, is that Grid Alternatives, which is the nonprofit company that has been charged with implementing the single-family housing initiative, recruits corporations, like in this case, Salesforce, to bring in their own installation crews and have them work for a day installing. Often the companies themselves finance the projects that their volunteer crews are working on, so that gets further bang for the buck in terms of this program reaching low-income communities. But we're not seeing enough of this happen. We need to see more of it happen. So solar's potential really is enormous. This is a map that was produced by Environment America using data from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it estimates that about 19 states get 100 times or more of, have solar potential that is equal to 100 times or more of their current electric generating needs. Another 15 states, including North Carolina, are in the range of 25 to 100 times current electric needs. So the potential is really pretty stupendous. And North Carolina is ranking pretty high, which doesn't tell the full story of what's happening in the state, as many of you probably know. I mean, it's number 4 in installed solar capacity. A lot of that is utility scale. A lot of that is owned by Duke Energy. And a lot of it was really stimulated by a pretty remarkable state tax credit, a 35% state investment tax credit that expired in December of 2015. So we'll have to see what happens going forward. There's a federal investment tax credit that many of you may know about that was extended at the 11th hour, and that tax credit will run through 2019 and will phase down in 21, 22. Hopefully we'll see solar develop further there. But one of the challenges in North Carolina, is that the renewable portfolio standards, which apply in many states, are not really doing much good for North Carolina at this point. If you look at California, its renewable portfolio standard is that 50% of all power must come from renewable sources qualifying renewable sources by 2030. Various other states are up in that range or a little bit lower, and actually places like Hawaii are targeting 2045 for 100% reliance upon renewable energy. North Carolina is at 12.5% by 2021, and there is some movement in the legislature to freeze it at its current level, which is at 6% of total power supply, which would really get the state nowhere. And what's worse is that the North Carolina Energy Council, it's the Energy Policy Council, part of the DEQ, is proposing that nuclear and gas be included in the renewable portfolio standard, which would basically eviscerate the standard in terms of its impact. So there's work to be done in this state. Another problem in the state that I'm sure you've heard about is that North Carolina is one of 4 states that does not allow third-party solar. That is, for a company to come in, put a solar array on your roof, retain ownership, and then sell you that power. And NC Warren, a nonprofit organization, is challenging this, put solar arrays on a church, the Faith Community Church in Greensboro. It's a very small array. It's about the size of the array on our house. But Duke Energy is so upset about this that it has filed a petition with the PUC here and is seeking damages on the level of $1,000 a day for the operation of this facility in violation of the bar on third-party solar. So there's some real challenges ahead in addressing solar in North Carolina. Just looking at Duke Energy's profile going forward, its integrated resource plan is pretty telling, I think. Its current use of, and this is for the 2 Carolinas, I should say, coal now generates about 31% of the 2 Carolinas' power supply for Duke Energy. They propose that by 2028 that would drop to 20%. Nuclear would rise to 30% from its current 27%, and gas would jump to 28% from its current 19%. Renewables, they say, would reach 4% by 2028. So Duke Energy does not really have a renewable energy vision that many people can rely on going forward. I'll skip that for now. But my book really tries to look at the beginnings of a transformation from a system where utilities are accustomed to generating lots of kilowatt hours to a system where utilities are going to have to be much more versatile providers of comprehensive energy services, and that might include storage, it might include demand resources management, and we're just beginning to see that happen. So I encourage you to take a look at my book, as my wife and daughters are doing here, and I'm happy to field some questions and comments. Questions, comments? Yes?
So is there a problem with producing the solar panels in terms of resources used and
Well, not all solar panels are created equal. So silicon-based, the most common solar panel today is a crystalline silicon solar panel, which basically uses the most common element, one of the most common elements on Earth, and very few toxics. Thin film solar uses some toxics like cadmium telluride that do create a problem more on the disposal end of the spectrum. And there is a real issue with solar waste going forward, because if we reach significant solar reliance going forward, we're going to have billions of solar panels 25, 30, 40 years from now that are going to have to be disposed of responsibly. And that is a relatively benign task when you're looking at the crystalline silicon panels. It's a more challenging task when you're looking at thin film solar. And we're seeing solar technology evolve very rapidly, so it's a little hard to know what is coming down the pike. But the issues also have to do with, well, what energy is being used to produce the solar panel. So if you're producing a solar panel in China based upon coal as the base for electricity, let's say, its carbon footprint is going to be very different than a solar panel produced in Oregon, which might be relying fairly heavily upon hydropower, for example. So those are some of the factors really at play there. Yeah.
What are the economic arguments and underpinnings for solar? I mean, I guess I can understand the environmental and emotional argument that this is a good thing to do, but I mean, start with a simple case. Your house.
Yeah.
I mean, what does it cost you to put those panels up there? How much does that save you a year in terms of power?
Right.
In terms of electric power that you would be buying otherwise?
Our estimate, we paid, the nominal cost of our solar array was about $27,000. After the federal tax credit, and there was state benefits as well, we ended up paying about $17,000 for the installation, and we estimate that during 5 to 7 years of operation, we will recoup the full investment in that technology with those subsidies. But I think when you talk about subsidies, you can't talk about subsidies for solar in a vacuum. And we've been subsidizing the oil, gas, coal, nuclear industries for decades and decades. And I think one of the problems is that those subsidies go relatively unquestioned, whereas the solar investment tax credit and the production tax credit for wind are questioned practically every year and often are allowed to lapse, which creates a very uncertain climate for example, the manufacturers of this technology. If you're going to build a factory, you want to know with reasonable certainty what the economics are going to look like over a, let's say, 10, 15, 20-year period. And the renewable industries have not been given that luxury. But let me just say one thing about the cost per kilowatt hour, the life cycle cost per kilowatt hour, because what's happening is solar is converging very quickly on gas. It's already much cheaper than building, for example, a new nuclear plant, or if you were to build, so Lazard did a study, and Lazard estimates that solar today costs between 7.2 and 8.6 cents per kilowatt hour generated, life cycle cost. Natural gas is probably in the 6 cent per kilowatt hour range. A new nuclear plant is probably in the 13 to 14 cent per kilowatt hour range. And if you were to build a new coal plant or a gas plant that dealt with carbon sequestration, for example, you're driving the price of those up way beyond the cost of solar. So you're really looking at a technology which is competitive, certainly with the federal tax credit today, and close to competitive even without it. So I think that what we're seeing with the investment tax credit on a phase down going through 2021, 2022 is an appropriate way to integrate solar into our economy.
If I could ask one more question from the utilities point of view. I mean, if it's cloudy or snowing in Boston for 3 days, you've got to get your power from somewhere.
That's certainly true.
So the utility has to maintain the backup capability to
Yeah.
provide for your needs.
A raging debate is now happening in 20-plus states over how net metering should be valued economically. Because right now, most states provide the full retail value of that kilowatt hour that you're not using. And the utilities are saying that's not fair because we're still maintaining the distribution infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, backup power generation infrastructure. And I think it's a legitimate question as to how to strike the right balance in terms of appropriate compensation for distributed solar power. And that debate will be ongoing for the next several years, I'm sure, and will create lots of friction and hopefully some reasonable outputs. I think one of the challenges with wind and solar is these are technologies that 15 years ago really didn't exist within the marketplace. They existed in terms of the technology, but the regulatory infrastructure lagged. And what we're now trying to do is play catch up in developing the right signals for technology that is itself evolving very rapidly with the price of solar coming down, the price of wind coming down. I think it will be in the unfolding, but it's a legitimate question and a legitimate concern that utilities are raising. But I think that utilities also have to become a lot more versatile in what they're offering to their customer base and not simply try to stonewall solar power, which is what a lot of them are doing today. Yes.
Yeah, and a part of this conversation here, real quick, is storage. The issue of storage is sort of the next shoe to drop in this. And there's a lot of research being done in terms of addressing just that. Solar is intermittent at the moment, but how do you harness that? But my question, I'd be curious about your thoughts about wind, specifically in North Carolina with the first utility-scale solar farm. In Perquimans County, a wind farm,
yeah.
wind farm,
Yeah.
the Amazon project, and our, geography is great for wind out on the coast of Carolina.
Yeah.
There is some pushback on that, but where do you see that going, and in the future of wind in this state and in the nation?
Yeah. Well, we've seen offshore wind take off literally in many parts of Europe. And I think part of the challenge right now is for any single offshore wind farm to make a go of it, incurs significant costs in terms of how do you hook into the grid. If we were to build a robust offshore transmission line, which Google and others are talking about doing, it would make it a lot easier for individual projects to site themselves. North Carolina's offshore wind is among the best, probably the best in the nation. So there's huge potential there. Is it more expensive than land-based wind? Yes. But again, I think we have to look toward the long term in terms of, are we comparing offshore wind to onshore wind, or are we comparing offshore wind to coal combustion with carbon sequestration or gas with the same? North Carolina's onshore winds are not as robust as many other states, but that isn't to say that you can't capture significant amounts of wind within the state. In my state of Massachusetts, we have a dilemma where various parties were adamantly opposed to the Cape Wind project in Nantucket Sound, largely because of visual issues. There are people in the Berkshires, mountains in the west, where there's also good wind, don't want wind there either. And I think part of what we really need to do is develop a 21st century visual aesthetic that says that a wind farm is an affirmative as opposed to a negative, and that we have to just incorporate that, I think, perspective into our lives. I think one of the reasons that wind has taken off much more quickly in Europe than in America is that I think Europeans are much more pragmatic about integrating the built environment, the lived-in environment, with the natural environment. I think we have the kind of manifest destiny approach of, the endless frontier in America that we want to preserve. And unfortunately, even people like Teddy Kennedy, who I generally revered as a leader in pushing the right kinds of energy and other policies forward, was vehemently opposed to the Cape Wind project because of the visual impacts of wind turbines that were going to be 6 miles at sea. So I think that has to change. But we have huge potential, and the potential isn't just in that wind belt that I showed you in the West. It's throughout much of the nation. Yes?
I'm curious to know, going back a bit to solar and financing of private homes, where the financial sector stands with this. You mentioned a couple examples of where families got support to install solar panels. Is the financial sector innovative, interested, or holding back on this kind of a question?
Well, there are various ways you can find, and again, it depends upon what your state allows. So in the many, many states that allow for what's called third-party solar, the great thing about third-party power purchase agreements is that it allows a homeowner who can't afford or doesn't wish to spend $17,000 on a solar array to have a company come in, install the solar array on their home, and then sell them the kilowatt hours at an agreed upon rate. So you get certainty over the period of the contract, which is often 15, 20 years, and you have no upfront costs, which is great. There are also lease agreements which allow for a similar kind of arrangement where you actually pay a lease fee, but you're actually getting the kilowatt hours that you generate, they're yours. Loans are also becoming a lot more, the finance sector is beginning to get a lot smarter about offering solar loans, so there are those options as well. One interesting thing that's happened on the utility level, actually, and it goes back to what is the appropriate role for government financing. In 2009, there was really no utility-scale solar to speak of. And it was at that point that the federal government's loan guarantee program began to make loan guarantees to a number of utility-scale solar farms. And what it did was it created a safer playing field for the big financial institutions to come in and say, utility-scale solar looks like a reasonable investment. Today, over half of new installed solar capacity is utility-scale. And a lot of that is because of a loan guarantee that I'm sure many of you know has been excoriated because of a few kind of iconic failures, the Solyndra Corporation being probably at the top, a manufacturing company that went under because of Chinese competition and because of the drop in the price of silicon. They were reliant upon a technology that was more expensive, but it used much less silicon. That changed. The company went under. The federal government's loan guarantee program was intended to absorb failure. The whole idea of the loan guarantee program was to deal with risky ventures and make them a little less risky and try to create marketability for those technologies. So I think the government has a role to play, and the private financial sector really is beginning to see the opportunities for solar investment. Yes?
On what grounds can Duke Energy petition other companies to install solar on rooftops in North Carolina? Because you had mentioned that a little bit earlier.
Ask the question once more.
So, what is their reasoning for petitioning other companies?
For trying to prevent them from installing. They have an exclusive service territory granted to them by the California Public Utility Commission. And they want to preserve their right to provide all of the power needs for all of the people in those areas. So it's willing to build utility-scale solar farms that it then incorporates into its rate base. But if your family installs a solar array and all of a sudden you go from buying 100% of your power from Duke Energy to buying 10% of your power from Duke Energy, they're taking a major hit. They don't want that hit, so they're trying to discourage that market. And one way they do so is by saying that these other competitors, private companies that want to come in and install solar on your home, are violating their agreement under Carolina law with the Public Utilities Commission. And this is not just happening in North Carolina, although unfortunately in terms of third-party solar, it's Carolina, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Florida that are the 4 states that are really trying to prevent third-party solar from happening. Yeah.
I heard what you said about the regulatory problems, but I'm wondering what the technological problems are in transmitting solar over large spaces. For example, could we put it on satellites and beam it down? Can we have these farms on the desert and transmit it to the East Coast? What's the technological problems?
Right. You lose with direct generation, with direct current as opposed to alternating current, you lose about 1% of the power generated per 100 miles, somewhere between 0.5% and 1%. So even if you're transmitting that solar power, or say wind power, let's say coming out of Wyoming, and you're transmitting it to California over 1,000 miles, you may be taking a hit in terms of the loss in power over that distance. But if you're generating that power incredibly cheaply in a state that has superabundant wind and has no need for that wind within the state, it's a small state, small population, et cetera, you come out ahead. And there are a number of lines that are being planned now as merchant lines, as private investment opportunities to bring, for example, wind power from Wyoming to the southern Nevada market and to the southern California market. It is happening, it will happen, and the utility regulatory structures and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission are trying to make it easier for this to happen. One of the challenges is that FERC is required to take any source of power that is being offered to it. So you can't build a dedicated, for example, solar power line or wind power line covering a great distance because someone else might build a natural gas turbine that would be, or a new nuclear plant that might be usurping a lot of that space on the line. But we're going to see, I think, a more robust transmission infrastructure developed. That said, I think that we can do a lot with storage. We don't need to simply rely upon transmitting electrons over hundreds or even thousands of miles. And one of the great opportunities for storage, there are lots of great opportunities for storage, everything from Elon Musk's power wall in your home's basement to the electric vehicles that are a wonderful mobile storage resource. If we were to have tens of millions of electric vehicles that people would be plugging in when they're not using them, and utilities could be drawing down on their batteries as well as charging their batteries, depending upon the ebbs and flows in the power supply, we could very substantially accommodate the intermittency of solar power, of wind power, and get to very high percentages of penetration for those technologies. One great example of balancing between technologies in terms of storage that happens is between Denmark and Norway. Denmark, on average, generates about 40% of its total power from wind right now. Sometimes that spikes to over 100% of its total power needs nationwide. And they wheel their surplus power to Norway, which has stupendous hydropower resources. And they have pumped storage reservoirs in Norway that will take that power when it is in surplus and very cheap, and then they will release it when it's needed back into the Danish and into the European grid. So I think that we're looking at a variety of technologies to address the storage issue as well as to address the transmission issue. Yes.
You mentioned that a number of North Carolina legislators are trying to get nuclear and gas into the RPS. Given the fact that storage is so nascent, solar has great potential, but without the sun shining at night, what do you think about the idea of nukes being kind of the argument that nukes could be a good way to get decarbonizing our energy supply more quickly and at scale than solar could in at least the next 10, 15 years?
First, nuclear is a very expensive technology, as I said, and it is reliant upon various federal supports that, without which it would be very hard to build a new nuclear plant. For example, there's an act called the Price-Anderson Act, which was actually enacted in the 1950s, that places a liability cap on reactor accidents. So if you own a reactor and something terrible happens there, you are not liable for more than $500 million. Well, you can imagine that Fukushima, Chernobyl, et cetera, ran up tabs a little bit higher than that. So we're subsidizing that technology. We've also been subsidizing it through tens and tens of billions of dollars in research and development. And I have to say, I lived in the Middle East for a decade. And to me, trying to draw a clear line between civilian nuclear and nuclear weapons development is a very, very precarious undertaking. And when I look at the world today, I see a lot of destabilized regimes and a lot of non-state actors. And the idea of proliferating access to nuclear materials, to me, is something that we need to take very, very seriously. So I don't personally see nuclear as a good transition. I also think that there's a danger of an either-or proposition. If we were to give the green light to a new generation of nuclear reactors, we would very likely be squeezing solar and wind out of the picture and other renewables out of the picture. So I think one can also talk about the unsolved nuclear waste dilemma. I think there are lots of problems with nuclear, and people talk about it as a low-carbon or non-carbon fuel. It's not really accurate because there's a lot of carbon that goes into actually producing the nuclear materials that go into the reactors, but I think it's a precarious alternative. One more question? Okay, thank you very much.